let's just go down the quick. And again, this is what causes affordable housing. Again, there's these different sectors, and it's different for everyone that's kind of facing, whether it be a $200 rent increase or full on getting kicked out for the rent to double. But what would you say if someone asked you what's the root cause of the fact that we now are struggling to have enough affordable units for the people in our city?
Jeepers, man. We're going into some big philosophical ideas. So
Are they though?
No. Well, I'm going to start with the fact that there's like the death of urban areas and this migration of people into city centers.
Okay.
Like that is efficient in a lot of ways, but it drives up real estate prices, and then it creates these kind of required labor tiers where there need to be certain people to work certain jobs. And then, unfortunately, they get squeezed out of the areas in which they work by the rising cost of real estate. And then, in theory, in a lot of these cities, they basically bus people in that live in affordable areas outside of town and get bussed in to do labor effectively. And here in Nova Scotia, we don't even have the advantage of that because we don't have a good transit system.
Yeah.
So, we've got a situation whereby there's a peninsula surrounded by water. It's very concentrated, high value real estate, and people are getting squeezed out. And even the peripheral communities where they might be able to live more affordably, they cannot get to town, and they can't access resources like hospitals and all these things.
With that being said, how come cities like in Quebec, like in Montreal, the rents are still reasonably affordable?
I can't speak to that. I don't know. I haven't really...
Okay. So to go back to just originally what we said, what's causing it, you're saying the migration and the influx of people, which again, I think that's a fairly government-controlled thing. Like a lot of it is. Like a big portion of our growth is through immigration, which is something that the government's mandating and allowing. So they know how many people they're letting in. They're like, yeah, okay, we're going to approve 12,000 people this year to move here.
Yeah.
But then we're only going to approve 3,000 units.
I think that's, the
I understand it's two different levels of government.
Yeah,
I get that.
And that's kind of like, okay, the crux is, or the beginning point is, as a Western society, we have decided that in terms of services and resources, it is most efficient to jam people in a small area and build up.
Yeah.
That's kind of right or wrong. That is the
worldwide consensus.
That's what the approach we've taken. And I think we've struggled here with having other peripheral hubs that are also economically viable, that could offer more affordable places to live, that we're just drying up. Like if you look at a lot of our province, it was drying up in these other areas, which was forcing people to go to some of these spaces where I think, if Truro and Bridgewater and Sydney and, Kentville, they all became these little hubs where people could run businesses and have families, then I think that would alleviate some of the rental pressure. But I think that's kind of like the first thing. It's like, all right, we're jamming people in here, which means we're driving up the cost of real estate. And, then you start getting some of these side effects, I guess, if you will.
So there's a demand increase that's being, I wouldn't say created, but it kind of is. Like that's basically Canadian economy is based on immigration. I know there's the migration that we're seeing, so it's a double down. It's the immigration from out of country across Canada, and then there's migration hyper locally for us. There's a ton of migration, right? Like some place like Toronto, they're facing the opposite, I think, where there's people migrating out, and they're actually seeing rent drops. But like here, we're seeing a huge migration inwards. Mm-hmm. So that, and then, so for me, I always boil it back to supply and demand. I got in a pretty big conversation with somebody the other day, and they were going on about a lot of alternative topics to it. But I think it can be boiled back quite a bit to supply and demand. I understand there's a lot of...
And we're backlogged, right? We haven't had as much increase in supply as we've needed over the last 15 years, and we're eating it now as a result. Yeah. Right?
So I think that's kind of the thing. Like the thing that I find really bothers me, like you're saying, similar with this government programs, is like I look at the supply. It's very slow to come online, and the government doesn't make it much easier. They're not really super excited for landlords here to come on. It's been very, especially in Halifax, it's extremely. The landlords are very vocal about it, especially developers. The big developers are very vocal about it. But then I see things like, okay, federal government allots $300 million to whatever, the provincial government of Nova Scotia to provide affordable housing. And then I see, okay, we're going to do a study. It's going to take 18 months and $1.5 million to figure out what to do with the $300 million.
Yeah, or there's...
and I'm like...
There was one that came out and they said...
Look what all the developers are doing. Like, just build the shit.
But then there were some that was actually like, oh, but by the way, we have to award this money in the next 30 days.
I did.
So then you have kind of these haphazard applications, or you have things that were already in the works anyway.
Yeah.
Now getting this funding, it's like, well, that doesn't necessarily spur on more. And again, every little bit helps, but I think the problem is the government has thought too small, and in too many cases has just been like, throw money, let these groups do what they do. And one of the challenges is, again, those groups, they, in a weird way, end up competing against each other. There are limited funds, so you may have a group that tries to tackle this subset of the housing crisis and another group that tackles that subset, and now there's only so much money to go around.
Yeah.
And so rather than finding some, cohesion and some efficiencies by working together, they're kind of pitted against each other, which also is a problem. So I don't think the just throwing money at it is going to work. It hasn't worked. We do have to increase supply, though. That said, I love economics because it just says in a vacuum, this is what's going to happen, right? You increase supply, right? Prices are going to go down. It's true.
Yes,
however,
but even not in a vacuum.
Because there's no vacuum. But yes. But here's the thing.
If you drop 10,000 units on the peninsula right now, I'll tell you for free, I can give you a guarantee written insurance policy that rents are going to go down.
Listen, I agree with you. No
one's going to go out to these exterior neighborhoods like they are now and pay $1,500 a month.
I was trying to pivot, Neal. I was trying to pivot to make a point.
Okay, sorry.
No, I agree with you. However, if we return to those 10,000 units on the peninsula are not necessarily going to help someone who's currently paying $700. Like, their rent is not going to immediately stabilize necessarily. However, oftentimes, and you remember, you mentioned something like, okay, take the whole building, because there are going to need to be resources and other things in place with that client base.
Yeah.
And what I'm kind of alluding to is that oftentimes, the most at-risk individuals also have either health, mobility, or mental health struggles that make them doubly at risk.
Yeah.
So it's not just a simple vacuum of, okay, well, we jack up supply and now these people are going to be perfectly fine because their rent is just this amount. The challenge with, even in a perfect world, if the private sector starts, making it possible for individuals on lower income to pay a lower rent, they may still lack the other resources. And that's another issue. Like, these condensed cities, it's been proven it leads to mental health issues, right?
Yeah.
Like, it just does.
Yeah.
And so now you've got this portion of the population that, is...
Some people thrive, some people survive in every environment.
Yeah. I mean, so, again, you can't tackle the housing issue for the people
blanket thing.
Yeah, but like, the people who are most at risk in the housing crisis also are just the most at risk in life in general, and oftentimes.